Affirmative action, police in schools, and gender bias in STEM. Today's episode of Beyond the Bill Number covers it all with a dash of legal remedies. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we break down the legal jargon behind the issues you care about. I'm Stephen, and today we're diving into a topic that's, well, as old as the education system itself: racial and gender discrimination. It's 2024, and while we've come a long way since Brown v. Board of Education, we still have a lot of ground to cover. So joining me today is Sarah. How's it going, Sarah?
Hi, Stephen. It is going great, and I'm excited to tackle such a massive topic with you today. So, Stephen, I guess before we dive into things today, do you have any perspective of this from the other side of the pond?
Well, so education has always been sort of one of those areas where discrimination has been rife. It was generally, in the early days, obviously discrimination against anybody who didn't have any money. So only rich people really went to university or had any kind of education. And that, of course, tended to be rich men. So women certainly weren't given any kind of education. They were sort of considered, why do you need to go to school if all you're going to do is have babies and so on. So there's a genuine thing that lasted for millennia, centuries and millennia. It wasn't considered important that women would get an education. I mean, one really sort of clear example of this is from back in 1891. So most people will have heard of Marie Curie, famous scientist. Her full name, at the time when she was alive, I think she insisted on using her full name, which was, if I can pronounce it correctly, Marie Skłodowska Curie, because she was Polish. So she was born in Poland and raised up in a very sort of, say, aspirational family in Poland. Her father in particular was very, very keen on sort of sciences and education and so on. And both of his daughters, he insisted they get a good education. And but she was obviously a bit of a prodigy. So she wanted to go to university, obviously. But it turned out in those days in Poland, women weren't allowed to go to university. So her father sent her and her sister, in fact, to Paris. So she studied at university in France because France was a little bit more advanced in those days. And of course, the rest is history. She went on to be perhaps one of the most prominent scientists in the entire world. She's won 2 Nobel Prizes, the only woman to ever win 2 Nobel Prizes still, and the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different subjects. I think she won them in, chemistry and physics. And she had the privilege of naming 2 elements, which not many people get.
I didn't know that.
So she discovered radium. And she also discovered the element polonium, which she named after her native country of Poland, because she was a sort of very proud of being a Pole. But she's a great example of someone who was discriminated against, obviously, and she was discriminated later in her career as well. So she won her first Nobel Prize jointly with her husband, who was French. But the Academy didn't want to give her the Nobel Prize as well, because they said, well, she was clearly just an assistant or something. So they just wanted to give it to her husband. But actually, all of the people involved, all of the sort of the establishment refused this, and they forced the Nobel Academy to actually give her the award as well, because I suspect she actually probably did a little bit more towards it than her husband did. But yeah, so history is rife with those kinds of anomalies, really, and women being denied education. Whereas we know now, of course, women outperform men at university. They're more likely to go to university, and they tend to do better when they're there than men do. I mean, do you have any similar type of stories?
Yeah, I was thinking that it's so funny because who I wanted to talk about was Katherine Johnson, and she is one of the women who is highlighted in a movie called Hidden Figures, if you've ever seen it. It's about
great
three
film,
black...
yes, it's a great film.
Taraji P. Henson is one of my most favorite actresses. I love her. And so she's kind of the main character in it, but Katherine Johnson is one of the other characters that they highlight in the film. She was the first black woman to go to a graduate school in West Virginia, and it was in 1937. So that's 40 years later than what we're talking about. And also, what's crazy is she's mathematics, a scientist, and she studied French. So we have like a through line of French and a through line of science here. Yeah. But it's so cool to see the women that, it's a lot of the women in STEM that have really pioneered this. And I just think that's something that's so cool about people who like science, and it feels like there are these trailblazers trailblazers with such a thirst for knowledge, and they just won't let their light be extinguished, and they have to get to school, they have to learn. There's just such a ferocious appetite for that, which is, you know, this catalyst to get them in the door, which I just think is a really cool thing, and it's really empowering. And
Absolutely.
yeah. But yeah, I was reading a report that there's more, the United States at least is becoming like more educated on the woman's side than the man's side, and it's more common for women to go to school than for men now, and men are kind of going back to trades and other things like that. So it's kind of an interesting time that we're in.
Yeah, and the I remember when I worked back at the Department for Education, we looked a lot at different sort of sectors and who was doing better than others, and one of the worst performing groups was white men.
Wow.
Whereas girls obviously were doing very well. It was the boys who were not doing so well, and that's an issue now. And it's interesting that what policymakers really need to be focusing on now is how to get boys engaged in education, not girls, and how to try and actually equalize the gap between girls and boys when it comes to education.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the pendulum of history swings back and forth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And all for the best, of course. You can't be ignoring 50% of your population when it comes to, innovations and skills and so on. You need to make sure that everyone can participate. I mean, there's still a big disparity though. If you look at things like engineering, there are still a far few engineers around, female engineers around than there are male engineers. I mean, one of the statistics we used to have, which was quite staggering, was that in England, we had a smaller proportion of female engineers than in Saudi Arabia. Which you would think Saudi Arabia has a bit of a reputation for not really supporting women into employment, and yet they have more female engineers than we did, proportionally speaking. So there are still a lot of battles to be fought there.
Well, should we get into it?
Yes, let's get into it. So, let's start with the basics then. So, in a podcast a few weeks ago, we talked about House Joint Resolution 165, which sought to disapply new rules about how gender identity is protected. And when we were talking about that, we spoke about Title IX, but today we're going to take a little bit of a broader look at Title IX because it's obviously an absolutely crucial bit of legislation. So we've had schools in the US integrated for decades now, and Title IX has been around since the 1970s. But we're still facing discrimination despite all of the progress that's been made. So why is discrimination still such a big problem in the US?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it just goes away. And I mean, you can kind of think of a lot of these issues like cockroaches. They just somehow keep surviving. And they're always kind of there, and like you might see it, and you get a little bit of a jump scare, and then you kind of go back to not thinking about cockroaches very much, at least in Colorado, because we don't have a lot of bugs here. I'm not really sure if you guys have a lot of cockroaches where you are in the UK.
Yeah, we love our cockroaches.
Okay, well, yeah, I think I've barely ever seen one in Colorado. That's why I live where they are. Hurts my face. But these types of ideas, these pervasive pieces of our society always kind of find their way in. And so, we can pass legislation, we can work to educate people more, and, we can kind of move forward as much as we can try as a society. But it's always kind of like sneaking in here and there. And racial and gender discrimination is kind of really at the heart of a lot of these issues within our society, and honestly, societies all over the entire world. And it's interesting, kind of depending on where you are. It might be, a matriarchal society where there's some discrimination against men. There's, the patriarchal society, which we're, more familiar talking about of the discrimination against women. And then, the racial disparities across the world have really, shown themselves pretty intensely over the last few years, whether, it be the Uyghurs or Black Lives Matter. It's kind of all over the place where people are looking. We're, still seeing some pretty intense different treatments of different types of people from around. So, that's because it's deeply ingrained. It's systemic. It's in our behaviors, and we've made big strides, especially here in the U.S. We don't have segregated schools anymore by law. The biases persist, and there's also more subtle ways that people can kind of see this, like who gets punished at school, who gets sent to the principal's office, who gets opportunities, who is in an opportunity to be able to have the experience to apply for a job, to actually have the experience needed, and kind of who doesn't.
Yes, I remember seeing a DOJ study which showed that minority students face harsher penalties than white classmates. I mean, it was quite shocking, really. Also, that like African American students were expelled at 3 times the rate of white students, which you wouldn't think was still happening. It feels like direct discrimination, as though they're deliberately targeting those students, but I suspect it's a bit more subtle than that.
Yeah, you're right. When you kind of dig into it, you can realize it's not about race. It's about the perception of authority and bias and conscious or unconscious bias that people have. And I don't know if you've ever done one of those tests to see if you're a racist. There's one from
Oh, yeah.
like Harvard. And I remember I did it
Yeah.
probably my first month into college, and I went to a liberal school. I remember being like, oh, I'm so not racist. Like, I am so pro everybody. And then, I did the
Yeah.
thing, and I was like, yeah, you a racist. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
Like, I learned all about
No.
implicit bias and all this stuff. And, it rocked me pretty intensely, but I hadn't known about implicit biases that we have.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, because I worked at the civil service, which is very woke in some ways, we used to have to do unconscious bias training every year, like
Yeah.
the same training over and over again. And we had to do special training before we did any kind of recruitment in particular, to sort of become aware of these sort of unconscious biases and do what you can to sort of mitigate the effects of them and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating stuff, particularly when you look at the statistics and the research that's been done in this area, and how it's not a case of not being biased. You can't not be biased. Everybody's biased. So you need to find other workarounds to make sure that that bias isn't going to actually affect certain groups of people.
Yeah, and it's being cognizant of it. And, when we look at kind of, that statistic you were talking about of all these students getting expelled at such a higher rate, I'm sure teachers and administrations have some kind of bias training, but it's more common for people to see minority students as kind of trouble, and this perception influences their decisions. And an influence might be that between John and Eric, you have a shorter fuse for John just because he seems like trouble. And so Eric could be doing the same thing, but John is the one getting sent to the principal's office because you're just quick to act there. And so it's not necessarily that we're still seeing like overt racism, like people shouting slurs. It's more like, this kid looks like he's about to cause trouble, and the system is kind of stacked against so many of these kids before they even step in the classroom.
Absolutely. So that's a perfect segue into the legal context here. So let's talk about laws that are designed to combat racial discrimination in education, both direct and this kind of indirect discrimination as well. So specifically then, Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, absolute seminal bits of legislation here. They've been around for decades, but are they still effective?
Yeah, you can think of Title IV as kind of the OG of anti-discrimination laws in education. And it says that no federal funds can be used for schools that discriminate based on race, color, or national origin. And this was really a game changer back when it was put into effect. And it still packs quite a punch today because schools still have to prove that they're not doing that in order to get the federal funding that all of these schools really need. So it's kind of, a way to keep people in line by withholding something that they want to make them, behave well. Like, you don't get your allowance if you're naughty. Here's the catch. It's a very kind of reactive thing, and it steps in after the discrimination has already happened. And again, it's, the punishment of the school after it's been found out to be that way. Data shows that minority students face harsher policing, which also really exacerbates the problem. And, there is a reality where some students who are minorities might have a harder time, but that might be because of other pieces of the system that is making it harder for them in their life outside of school. And that's showing up while they're in school because they're spending most of their time in school, and they're, still being who they are when they're in school. And, whatever's happening outside of school, whether it be your mom's working 3 jobs and you're helping care for your brothers or whatever it might be, that will still show up for you. And so there's other pieces there that, a student might be more difficult, but why are they being more difficult? possible? And can we take a second to kind of think of that and kind of look at addressing those pieces as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, and you mentioned something earlier about women in STEM facing sort of unique challenges, and we've discussed a little bit of this. So, gender bias, though, despite all the improvements, is still alive and kicking too. So, what's the role of Title IX here?
Yeah, so Title IX has done a lot, and it's why women's sports programs are flourishing. But it's
Mm,
also a foundation for fighting gender based discrimination in schools. And when it comes to things
mm,
like academic evaluations, access to STEM fields, or even just an everyday classroom interaction, there's still subtle bias all over the place. For example, women in STEM still face the, you don't belong here mentality a lot, or,
mm,
kind of thinking that a woman's brain might not work like that, or there's a lot of
mm,
things about how a male mind is very rational and a woman's mind is, kind of that more creative and not so rational thinking. And so those are things that often people attribute to success in STEM, and are still
mm,
kind of, there's microaggressions around the way a woman might approach a problem versus a man, or communicate about solution to something, or propose a
sure.
solution. And women in general are a little bit more soft with their communication and how they show things. And
Mm,
a lot of times, if you're not the loudest voice in the room, you might not be the one that's heard. And so that's also
exactly.
interesting piece there of kind of the gatekeeping. And
Mm.
so Title IX can help, but it's also not a magic wand.
And then there's also the issue of harassment, which hits both race and gender. Schools are supposed to be safe, inclusive environments, but obviously that's not always the case, is it? So, how do institutions address harassment effectively?
Yeah, the key here is really clear guidelines and accountability. And it's one thing to say we don't tolerate harassment, and it's a completely other thing to actually
Mm,
have a system in place that enforces that and makes it safe and easy and, straightforward for people to deal with
mm,
issues of harassment and kind of navigating through that process. And schools really need reporting procedures to support victims
mm,
and real consequences for perpetrators. And they need to build an inclusive culture kind of from the ground up, because harassment thrives in environments where people feel isolated or marginalized or kind of at odds with each other. And so, kind of
mm.
working on almost, building the culture of school. We hear so much about culture of companies, but there's also culture in school and how to create belonging and inclusivity.
And obviously, all of that takes time, and that's one of the problems with the fact that every time the administration changes in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, there's a whole new set of rules issued to schools saying, "Oh, now trans people are included. No, trans people are not included. Inclusive bathrooms. No, not inclusive bathrooms."
Mm-hmm.
And all of those changes means that it's very difficult to build these cultures because it takes time to build culture, and you need consistency and continuity over a long period of time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I think a lot of schools struggle. They don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They can't remember from one week to another what approach they're supposed to take. Let's talk then about the kind of solutions we need. So, affirmative action policy has obviously been a really big one historically, but then the Supreme Court recently has issued several rulings that have meant that affirmative action has had to be scaled back. So what do schools do now to promote diversity?
Yeah, I mean, talk about things changing administration to administration. I feel like affirmative action is one of those things that has, again, been on this pendulum
Mm,
year by year. It's like, oh, yes, this is helpful for us. Oh, no, it's the worst thing ever and it's so unfair. And then,
mm,
we're going back and forth all over the place. But these recent rulings have really shaken things up, and schools are having to rethink their entire approach of what they're doing, how they're getting people in the doors, and what's going on there. And some things that they're leaning into is kind of a need-based scholarship for minority students. And one of the things that kind of naturally has segregation now is schools are expensive or neighborhoods are expensive, and so people who have money to live there might not be the most diverse group of people. And so there's kind of natural
mm.
segregation happening. And so these kind
Yeah.
of needs-based scholarships and things like that can kind of help integrate a little bit more. But I
Mm,
think we talked a little bit before on a different episode, but there are people who figure out how to get the needs-based scholarships just because they want them and they don't necessarily need them. And it's kind of the age-old time of, if there's a loophole, someone's gonna find it. There's some issues there of how to actually provide these and make them super supportive. And, you want to have this go for minority students that, you can create partnerships and organizations that support these marginalized groups. And the goal ultimately is to create these diverse and inclusive environments. But, you don't necessarily need in the world of this a race-based quota like affirmative action once allowed, and that's going to take some thinking and some creative ways to approach the problem of actually trying to get minority people in the building without there being, okay, it has to be at least 17% Black and at least 37% Hispanic and this and that, and there's definitely some huge complications there, and it's not impossible, but it's definitely a new big challenge for us here.
Absolutely. All right. So just before we wrap up then, I mean, let's just look at one other aspect of this, which is technology. So we talk a lot about artificial intelligence, AI, these days. So can AI help to reduce discrimination, or is it just creating new kinds of biases?
Yes, the age-old AI question. That's all we've talked about in 2024, it seems. But yeah, I mean, AI has the potential to help, but it can also perpetuate existing biases. And if it's not handled correctly and the AI isn't trained correctly, the systems learn from the data that's fed to them, and that data reflects human bias, and boom, it's spitting out biased results. And I think that there was some story when ChatGPT first came out, somebody trained the app on a whole bunch of super racist stuff, and it started spitting out all this really gross things. And it's with the AI trained, like everything, we need to recognize and kind of counteract the biases and ensure that the systems are kind of getting fed the best of humanity and not the worst of humanity, and kind of moving in that way. And I think that's also why it's so important, all of the conversations that we have been having about legislation that's kind of limiting the role of AI, and understanding that, because again, if we're not training our AI appropriately and we're putting AI in a space of launching a nuclear bomb, and it's racist, and it's like, the white people in Colorado are awful, let's launch that nuclear bomb. Like, that's terrifying. And so there's a lot of things there. Yeah.
Very much a double-edged sword. But I mean, one of the things about AI is, of course, you can give it the same input and it will spit out two completely different things. So hopefully that means people aren't going to always saying don't rely on it too much, always double check everything, and bear in mind that it may well reflect our own biases because it's been trained on content that we've created. Basically, then we're in a tech revolution, but we still have to watch out for those age-old cockroaches, biases.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much for breaking it all down for us. This is certainly an issue that's not going away anytime soon, but with the right tools, the right laws in place, we can still keep making progress.
Yes, absolutely. And we've come a long way, but there's still plenty of work to be done. And the most important thing is to kind of stay present and aware of what's going on around you, and keep pushing forward. So thanks for that. And the images of cockroaches today.
Absolutely. Cockroaches did feature quite heavily in this podcast, which I wasn't expecting, I think, when we started making it. But there you go. You never know where it's going to go, do you? So that's a wrap on today's episode. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, check out the blog for more information on racial and gender discrimination in education and the legal remedies that are out there. And thanks for listening. And we'll catch you next time on Beyond the Bill Number. Don't forget, if you've got anything you'd like us to talk about, let us know in the comments below.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.